Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We will now be getting started. Thank you again for joining us for the National Back to School Digital Teaching Part 2 of 3, presented by Policing Free Schools, namely titled Policing in Schools, National Landscape and Terrains. Before moving forward, I would like to acknowledge that I am on stolen Indigenous land and recognize that these lands have been and continue to be inhabited by many nations of Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. While we're gathering from multiple Indigenous lands across Turtle Island and connecting through this virtual space, I would like to acknowledge where Policing Free Schools is based as myself as well, and that is what is colonially known today as the province of Ontario, and more specifically located on the original lands called Toronto. I acknowledge the original peoples of these lands, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples who also called these lands home. Acknowledging as well those who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic enslavement trade. And so honoring and paying tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent. And with this stated, it is necessary to move beyond acknowledgements, right? This is not just a checkbox being marked off. It is Indigenous, Black Afro-Indigenous, Black African diasporic peoples, including across their intersecting identities. Those who are disabled, neurodivergent, two-spirited LGBTQIA+. Those are who are most negatively impacted by police, by colonial violence, by police and policing in schools, policing and carceral logics, culture practices, systems and structures across so-called Canada and even globally. And they continue to be systematically harmed and denied humanity. It is both our individual and collective responsibilities to dismantle these systems. Thank you once again for joining us for our National Back to School Digital Teaching Part 2 of 3, namely titled Police and Policing in Schools, the National Landscape and Terrains. And so through this political education teaching and knowledge mobilizer, I will be going in depth, doing an overview about the national landscape and terrains of police and policing in schooling and educational spaces across so-called Canada. You're going to be gaining knowledge on the fundamentals that anchor us at Policing Free Schools. We'll be introduced also to the importance of shifting away from the school to prison pipeline metaphor and the reasons and the need to take up the school-prison nexus framework. You'll also build up your knowledge on what I call the police-free schools complex, and ultimately why the shift from police-free schools to policing-free schools is necessary. And hi, my name is Andrea Vásquez Jiménez, gender pronouns she, her, ella. I'm a Black Afro-Latina born to Colombian immigrant parents in what is known today as Toronto. I'm the director and principal consultant of Policing Free Schools, which is a community-based organization. I'm a national and regional movement builder, also make part of a national and international growing movement, working on these systemic issues in solidarity with and alongside people and our organizational partners based across so-called Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. I'm also a community and electoral political organizer, community educator, and my entry point actually into this type of work, more so around police in schools, initially was in 2013. It was due to young people who were voicing their concerns and raising the alarms around the issues of police in schools and this was at a time where I was part of another organization. I was also a lead organizer in the removal of the police in school program, namely the School Resource Officer program in 2017. Through a collaborative and community-led process from the Toronto District School Board, the largest school board in so-called Canada. Since then have been able to support other organizers, organizations, and schooling and educational spaces in this process. So a little bit about Policing Free Schools. Again, we're a community-based organization, and we're fundamentally really dedicated to catalyzing systemic changes. We're looking for a paradigm shift away from one that is grounded in punitive measures that actually shifts over to the co-creation of transformative, healthy, equitable, life-affirming, liberatory, healing-centered, and policing-free educational spaces. We're a convener and an organizational lead for the national campaign for a Policing Free Schools Canada, and as well as an organizational lead and convener for the provincial campaign for a Policing Free Schools Ontario. We're working alongside our national partners for expansion of regional campaigns across distinct spaces across so-called Canada as well. And so a roadmap for today, we're going to be jumping into what anchors policing free schools. What do we mean by when we say policing free schools, and what guides us? We'll also see some fundamentals of policing free schools that, again, is anchoring our work. And we're going to jump right into a brief but very important broad context of policing and connecting that context to policing and police within schooling and educational spaces. We're then going to be looking at the landscape and terrains of police and policing in schooling and educational spaces across so-called Canada. And lastly, we'll be concluding with jumping into the police-free schools complex and really talking about the necessary shift from police-free schools and moving towards policing free schools. And so in regards to what anchors policing free schools, it's really important that we fundamentally all understand what do we mean by when we say police-free schools, policing free schools. And at Policing Free Schools, we align with our US-based national campaign partners. They are our national partners who co-lead the national campaign in the US, and that is the Advancement Project and the Alliance for Educational Justice. They are based in what is colonially known today as Washington, D.C. And the collective campaign definition that is extended to policing free schools, and I will quote, is dismantling school policing infrastructure, culture, and practice, ending school militarization and surveillance, and building a new liberatory education system. And I'm going to repeat again the collective campaign definition because it is extremely important that as we move through this teaching, that there is a basis, that there is an understanding of what do we mean by when we're talking about moving towards police and policing free school futures. And that is, again, dismantling school policing infrastructure, culture, and practice, ending school militarization and surveillance, and building a new liberatory education system. And let's jump right into fundamentals of policing free schools. And so what's really fundamental is really acknowledging that equity-driven, anti-oppressive, anti-racist, life-affirming, liberatory, and healing-centered educational spaces, wherever it may be, is not possible with police, policing, and or carceral measures, right? And so how do we actually move towards police and policing free schools? And for us, it is through non-reformist reforms. And Critical Resistance, an amazing organization, really delves into what is the distinction between reformist reforms and non-reformist reforms. And so reformist reforms are those actions which continue or expand the reach of policing, and non-reformist reforms are those that work to chip away and reduce its overall impact, right? And so when we're looking at policing free schools and our fundamentals, we are saying no to the replication of oppressive structures, right? This can be looked at through, increase of police in schools through other means, whether it's any form of expansion, increase, and or entrenchment of police at schools, or really any school-related activities, even if it is off of school property. right? Looking at reformist reforms to initial and original police and school programs, right? Whether it's looking at the creation of a quote unquote new program, right? The creation of a school police department, the creation of a police-led school, regardless if it is coupled with an educator, right? Those are reformist reforms, right? Another example are renaming, rebranding, revising, reimagining, updating, and so forth, right? Those are forms of reformist reforms which actually expand policing, right? So another aspect is changes to its composition, right? We're not asking for necessarily less number of police, right? Some schooling and educational spaces may say, hey, we can give equality of police. So all the schools can have them, right? And so we're not talking about all schools having them, but rather whether it is one, some, or all schools, the detrimental negative impacts are still present. So again, it's not about asking for less number of police, right? Another reformist reform that would perpetuate the status quo, that perpetuates oppressive structures, would be this notion of increasing diversity of police, right? There's this notion that increasing Indigenous or Black African diasporic or racialized or queer and trans police officers within schooling educational spaces would make some changes to the systemic impacts. That is a complete false narrative, right? This notion that having more specific roles and responsibilities or additional trainings. But at the end of the day, all of these are examples of reformist reforms that actually expand policing and entrench policing within schooling and educational spaces, and we say no to that. Another fundamental and another example is the increase of policing and carcerality through other means, right? And so maybe not necessarily police presence, but it would be looked at a form of expansion and increasing and or entrenchment of policing and carceral measures at schools and educational spaces, which we'll be talking about later on in the education, in this educational teaching. But some of those pieces would be looking at carceral measures, such as increasing punitive disciplinary practices and so forth, right? We're also saying no to carceral care alternatives, which again perpetuates the status quo. This notion that just automating social workers, psychologists, and counselors, which are also in many aspects fundamentally anchored by the same root, that this automation somehow will magically fix things, right? When looking at ensuring alternatives that will actually support students, that will support the well-being of educators within schooling and educational spaces, it's really acknowledging that it's not just about them being representative of students that they are serving, but also be fundamentally grounded in healing-centered engagement and practices. And that is definitely not carceral. We also say no to replication of oppressive structures through policing in school programs, which are distinct from police in school programs. Police in school programs really are talking about, your local police officers from local departments and or RCMP police in school programs. Policing in school programs are those that are led by not necessarily your police from local departments, but are led by special constables, peace officers, private security, and so forth, or even looking at software and technological surveillance, right? So we're not asking to replicate these harms through any of these other means. And so for a broad context, a brief but quite important context of policing, there's this normalized assumption that safe and safety equates with police presence, and increased police spending, right? When in reality, police presence, policing, and increased police spending does not equate to safety, right? The notion that they equate with safe and safety is a false narrative. In reality, again, we know that thriving and healthy communities, including schooling and educational spaces, which in and of themselves are safe, have more supports and resources, not more policing. There's more than enough reports, there's more than enough data, research, lived experiences, and living experiences that continuously reaffirm what we already know about the detrimental negative impacts of policing, and carceral measures. And when looking at data and research in regards to policing, we just have to look back at most recently another Canadian study published this past December. And the result of that study, it had actually examined a decade of data from Canada's 20 largest municipalities. And the result of the study was that even as police budgets continue to be ballooned, continue to be inflated, continue to increase, there is absolutely no association with lower crime rates or any increase to safety. And despite ample reports and research, for years we continue to see how elected officials choose to prioritize siphoning money out of our communities and funneling those funds into policing, right? Plundering of funds into police and policing, and also expanding carceral measures, including correctional facilities. There has been an ongoing underfunding, chronic underfunding of education, chronic underfunding and even defunding of healthcare and social service supports, to name a few. We are talking about knowing that creating conditions for healthy communities supports the co-creation of healthy schooling and educational spaces, and vice versa, particularly because schools and educational spaces exist within and are a part of our communities. And so this normalized assumption, this narrative of police equating with safety, that is also an ongoing narrative and normalized assumption and belief that police in schools equate with safe and safety, when in reality, police in schools does not increase safety, right? And there's this notion of disguising police in schools as evidence-based for safety, for community safety, and so forth. And that is intellectually disingenuous. That is not what the data, the research, the literature tells us when we look at it in relation to police and policing in schools, right? There's little to no evidence that police in school programs prevents or reduces violence in schooling and educational spaces. And there's no evidence to support the notion that these programs make educational spaces safer. And so, despite there being ample evidence, data, reports, and research telling us what we already know, again, we already know about the systemic impacts and harms of police and policing, including in schooling and educational spaces. And just as much data, reports, and research on evidence-based measures, what is actually evidence-based that actually would support the conditions for healthy, thriving, learning, and educational spaces, many elected officials and governments continue to choose to funnel funds, again, into policing, right? And the reality is that students' learning conditions are workers' working conditions. And what research continuously shows is that smaller classroom sizes, ample supports and resources, including but not limited to increase in teachers, educators, education workers, educational assistants, support staff, specialized services, mental health supports, wraparound services, before and after school programming, school food programs, clean water, clean air, alongside addressing root causes, addressing social and structural determinants of health and equity, is what creates healthy schooling and educational spaces. And most definitely properly funding and properly resourcing our schooling and educational spaces, which in and of themselves are safe, will co-create conditions for students' well-being and academic excellence, and also support the well-being of all those caring adults within our schooling and educational spaces. And so we're going to be jumping into the landscape and terrains of police and policing in schools. And so well, right before diving into this, again, this is a particular snapshot of time and space, both historical and contemporary. The terrains of police and policing in schools continuously shift. As such, this is a particular snapshot as of today and historically. And so when did some police and policing in school programs start, right? And so we know that in Regina-based schools in Saskatchewan, it started in 1949, and that was through the school safety patrol. And from 1950 to 1978, Regina police officers delivered also safety patrol and Elmer the safety elephant presentations in elementary schooling and educational spaces, right? So we're seeing police in school programs within the K-12 sector since the 40s, right? Looking at post-secondary schooling and educational spaces, for instance, in the University of Toronto in the province of Ontario, since 1904, that is over 100 years, right? Over 100 years, where that university hired its first police constable, who was also responsible for discipline, right? And so we can see from this chart that based on where you are, the date of police and policing in school programs starting may look different, right? So for instance, schools in Winnipeg in Manitoba started in early 2000s, as did some schools in Toronto within the Toronto region. In Vancouver, schools in the province of British Columbia started in early 70s, as did in Alberta, both in Edmonton and other spaces within the province of Alberta. In Charlottetown schools, an example in Prince Edward Island, would have started later in the 2000s. So again, based on where you are, the commencement of police and policing in school programs would be different based on your local respective spaces. And we know that police and policing in school programs, police in schools, and policing in schools is not a new issue, right? This is not a new issue. This is a historical and ongoing present issue. This is not an isolated issue. This is a systemic issue. This is a systems issue. This is an interconnected issue. And the reality, again, is detrimental impacts of police and policing in schools are systemic. Across so-called Canada, there may be multiple schooling and educational spaces that have attempted to be deemed as exceptional to this notion of not having a systemic issue within their particular schooling and educational space. And that is completely false. Their educational spaces are not different. Their police and policing in school programs aren't different. Their students in school community aren't different. Their educational space is not exempt from systemic issues, regardless of how they feel about being exceptional to the rule. This is not an isolated issue. This is also not just a local issue. This is very much a provincial and territorial issue, right? Our provinces and territories across so-called Canada govern the education. And so this is a provincial and territorial issue because they can take it up if they were to have the political will to ensure that we have properly funded and properly resourced schooling and educational spaces. And if they had the political will, they would mandate the removal of police from schooling and educational spaces and so forth. This is also a federal issue, and federally, because under our colonial system, financial responsibility for the education of Indigenous students falls under federal jurisdiction, namely the Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada. This is also a national issue. It is impacting schooling and educational spaces across so-called Canada. This too is an international issue, right? Even most recently, last year in November, in the lands of Teotihuacan, in what is colonially known as Montreal, Quebec, we had our international Police and Policing Free Schools Learning Exchange with our partners across so-called the US, the UK, and Canada. It was co-convened by the Alliance for Educational Justice, the Advancement Project, and as well as Policing Free Schools. And we see that this is a systemic issue. This is a global issue. And police and policing in schools is a human rights issue, right? Equitable access to education is a human right, and police and policing and carceral measures impedes this access, right? This is also a legal obligation as it is a human right. It is also a treaty issue. Red Thunder Women, also known by her colonial name Michelle Robinson, with the Reconciliation Action Group, reaffirmed that this is a treaty right. Police in schooling and educational spaces perpetuates ongoing colonial violence. This is a professional obligation issue. Schools, by provincial and territorial education acts, have advised to have welcoming, inclusive schooling and educational spaces, right? So this is also about upholding professional obligation. This is a public health and community health issue. This impacts the mental health and well-being also of students and caring adults within schooling and educational spaces. We know how this is a labor and union issue, right? Where we have millions and millions of dollars being funneled into police and policing. We continuously see divestments, money being siphoned and funneled out of education. It's also a financial issue. Having police and policing in schools is not fiscally responsible. One moment, please. And so when we're talking about students who are most negatively impacted, it is primarily Indigenous, Black African diasporic, racialized, disabled, neurodivergent, two-spirited LGBTQIA+, those who are undocumented, those with precarious status and mental health struggles, including across all intersecting identities. And so this is in regards to police and policing in school programs. With that said, we have seen significantly heightened levels of policing outside of police and school programs, most recently impacting Palestinian, Muslim, and Arab students, as well as folks who are in Palestinian solidarity. And these detrimental impacts, again, on these students who are most negatively impacted include negative impacts on their well-being and academic achievements as well. And so who exactly funds police and policing in schools across so-called Canada? And again, based on where you are situated, this may look completely different. For instance, an example in Prince Edward Island, their government has budgeted, has a budget line to put police officers into schooling and educational spaces, right? Another example is in Ontario, millions of dollars have been funneled into police and schools by way of grants, particularly through the Ministry of Solicitor General. In Regina and Saskatchewan, for example, the program has cost, one of their programs has cost over almost $2.5 million when it previously ran, and that was funded almost entirely by Regina Police Services, right? And so these are just some examples. But when we're talking about who funds police and policing in schools across so-called Canada, it can either be fully from the local municipal police services. It could be from the school boards who are paying that fully. It could be from, when we're talking about policing in school programs within post-secondary spaces, it's the post-secondary institutions. We have seen funds that have been put through the municipal government. Again, examples from provincial government. And also, again, based on where you are situated, it may look like a partnership where, let's say, 1/3 of the cost is going to be covered by the municipal government, by city council, with public tax dollars. All of these are public tax dollars, right? Another third could be covered by the school board. Another third could be covered by the local municipal police services, and so forth, right? So this looks very distinct based on where one is situated. And there is a reason why we place a question mark on federal government. So again, we know that funds for police and policing in schools can come from, again, local municipal police services, school boards, post-secondary institutions, municipal government, and provincial governments. What we are still trying to pinpoint and figure out is, are there any federal funds going into having police presence and police in schooling and educational spaces? So we have been undergoing multiple freedom of informations at the provincial level and local level. We have also been putting forward and undergoing access to informations, ATIs, at the federal level. With this said, we are currently working with the Civil Liberties Association, one of our partners, the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, just to really reconfirm if there may be any loopholes that may have been taken by the government to not disclose such information. And so again, currently the information that we do know from the access to information from the responses that we have had is, for instance, one from Public Safety Canada. So we have requested an access to information from the Department of Public Safety Canada on September 8th. This was actually last year. And they responded back stating that a thorough research was conducted and Public Safety Canada was unable to locate any records responding to the request. So as of right now, meanwhile, we look into whether there was any loopholes where they wouldn't have had to respond based on the request of information. But as of right now, it's deemed that Public Safety Canada is not providing any funds. Another access to information we had done more so recently in June was an access to information to the Department of Justice, which is distinct from Public Safety Canada. And so access to information privacy analyst had initially requested clarifications and has requested a 90-day extension. So we still are not aware whether the Department of Justice provides any federal funds to police and policing in schools. Another access to information that we have put forward was to the Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, Canada Indigenous Services, also regarding any possible federal funds to police and policing in school programs. And I will quote them. They recently had advised us in June, and I quote, "A search of the records under the control of Indigenous Services Canada has revealed none to be responsive to the subject of your request. The Education Branch of Education and Social Development Programs does not fund school-based policing through any of the program suite for any of the activities sought in this request." So currently right now, we are still moving towards undergoing additional access to information, including at the RCMP. And this is significantly important, especially when we're talking about federal funds to police and policing in school programs, primarily because we have multiple partners who have advised us of the reality that there are RCMP police in school led programs, right? And so if RCMP are federal, then are they not using also federal funds? And so this is definitely information that we will be having at a next updated national landscape and terrains once we do get the information. And so let's talk about police and policing school program names. There's a lot of them, right? based on where you are situated across so-called Canada, maybe the most popular police and school program or may be called the School Resource Officer Program, the SRO program. Or maybe it's most popularly known in your respective local spaces as a School Liaison Officer Program, right? The reality is that not all police and school programs are SRO programs or are SLO programs, right? But all SRO programs and all SLO programs are all police and school programs, right? So again, not all police and school programs are SRO programs, but every SRO program is a police and school program. And the reason why, out of best practice started calling them police and school programs is because there's a plethora, there is a multitude of police and policing and school program names, right? So we had mentioned the School Resource Officer Program, the School Liaison Officer Program as well. There is a Child and Youth Liaison Officer Program. There's a Student Liaison Officer Program. There's a Youth Liaison Officer Program. There's a Police Liaison Officer Program. There's a High School Liaison Officer Program. There's a Youth Education Officer Program. There's a Values Influences Peers Program. There's a Youth Enhanced Deployment Program. There's a School Engagement Team Officer Support Program. There's also specific additional names since doing this infographic, right? So this is not an exhaustive list across what we know to currently call today Canada, and also within post-secondary spaces, right? They either may be called special constables. In certain respective spaces, they may be still called campus police. They may be called peace officers, campus special constables, campus safety special constables. So again, this is looking at police and policing in school programs across all educational spaces and levels, and there is not one single encompassing policing in school program name across so-called Canada. So this is really important to be aware of when we're looking at the national landscape and trends of police and policing in schooling and educational spaces. And so let's talk about police and school program reviews, right? And so again, we know that there are more than enough reports, research, folks with lived experiences and living experiences. We don't actually need any more research to let us know, again, about the detrimental negative impacts of police and policing in schooling and educational spaces. And in reality, if one was to look at all the reports, look at all the reviews and the reports, they generally primarily all show that most folks will either be indifferent or they didn't know about it, or they'll state that they feel okay with the program, right? That they're not negatively impacted, right? And so with that, we really have to make a distinction about numerical majority, right? This is not a popularity contest. So even though reports will generally show a numerical majority saying that they either feel safe with police presence or that they have really no feels about it, that again, this is not a popularity contest. And when we are looking at this through a human rights-based approach, through a treaty rights-based approach, through an and also separately, even looking at it through an equity lens, right? First and foremost, we know that any continuation of police and policing in school programs is inequitable. It is gross negligence. It is an ongoing human rights violation. It is a violation to Indigenous peoples' treaty rights. And so at the end of the day, we know that when we are taking an equity lens, when we are taking, centering those who are most negatively impacted, when it is a human rights-based approach, when it's a treaty rights-based approach, it will always lead and end up in the removal of police in school programs, not reforms, right? It will end up as the removal of police in school programs as a first and necessary step, right? And that's what, when looking at all the reports, what they generally show, right? There are other reports, for instance, in Calgary, the review had shown more than half of the students being negatively impacted by police presence, right? And so again, we know that police presence, police in schools, policing in school programs perpetuate harm along, again, with violating human rights, treaty rights. It goes against school board policies, many educational spaces' own policies. It goes against provincial and territorial and multiple additional education acts. And so when we're looking at removal of police in school programs, there are quite a few, a lot more than a few, right? Across so-called Canada. The first removal of a police in school program was actually at the Toronto District School Board, and that was in 2017. And from the inception, there were folks organizing, right? From the inception of the program being introduced, there were folks such as JFAP, the Jane and Finch Action Against Poverty, were there from the inception. There are folks such as No Cops, known also by newly organized coalition opposing police in schools. There was young people, students out there protesting from the inception, such as Northern Secondary School students. And then years later as well, where I was also organizing for the removal in the year of 2017, I was with an organization called La Haine, also a part of another organization that also supported the removal, ENI, Education on Incarceration. This was a work alongside Showing Up for Racial Justice Toronto chapter, BLM Toronto, Black Lives Matter Toronto, and Educators for Peace and Justice, among many other folks that were pushing. So many of these removal of police in school programs and policing in school programs have been and are community-led wins, right? So for instance, at Winnipeg School Division and the Louis Riel School Division, one of our partners, Police Free Schools Winnipeg, along additional folks were pushing for the removal and successfully pushed for the removal of their police in school programs. We see also in Vancouver, where Cops Out of Schools, our partners, Cops Out of Schools, pushed for the removal of their particular police and school programs. We saw young people lead wins. Also, our partners at Silu Collective at the Ottawa Carleton District School Board. We saw also at the Waterloo Region District School Board, which was also primarily youth-led by Students for Inclusive Schools, the Black Brilliance Advisory Committee, and also even an example from a post-secondary, right, to stop a special constable program incoming, right, to prevent an incoming policing in school program. It was a Black Liberation Collective and the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy chapter at what's currently known today as Toronto Metropolitan University, right? So many of these wins have been and continue to be community-led wins. And so we know that we are grounded in an ongoing struggle, right? That those wins, yes, are 100% wins. And that continues us in this intergenerational and ongoing struggle. And I quote Angela Davis, "What we manage to do each time we win a victory is not so much to secure change once and for all, but rather to create new terrains for struggle." I've come to the conclusion that our work as activists is always to prepare the next generation, to create new terrains so that those who come after us will have a better opportunity to get up and engage in even more radical struggles. And I think we're seeing this now. And so we recognize that we are in an ongoing intergenerational struggle. And so when looking at the national landscape and terrains of police and policing in schooling and educational spaces across so-called Canada, and doing diving into a national analysis, there are particular trends that do show up. And so let's look into those national trends. And so most previously, when we're talking about community-led police and police and peace school wins, we saw that our partners, as mentioned, based out in Vancouver, British Columbia, Cops Out of Schools, our partners alongside multiple other folks pushed for the removal of their police and school program, right? And so we have been seeing a national trend of pushing on the other side for a reversal of police-free schools wins. So to provide some context, with the removal of this particular, the Vancouver School Board police and school program, it was reinstated by ABC Vancouver slate of candidates, right? So in Vancouver, police had endorsed the ABC Vancouver slate of trustees on the campaign. One of their main promises was to, reinstate a police and school program at the Vancouver School Board. Those slate of trustees were elected, and their first order of business was to reinstate the police in school program that was previously removed, that had gone through an in-depth report, review, detrimental negative impacts. Multiple people were coming out to do delegations and so forth, right? And so they now reinstated a police and school program as a revised and reimagined, right? This coding it revised and reimagined school liaison officer police and school program. And so what we're seeing is that even though at that time, Kasari Govender, the British Columbia Human Rights Commissioner, called for an end of police in schools across the province, we still saw this move forward. And our partners at the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, with so much concern, they came out with a Know Your Rights resource, particularly because the notion of revised and reimagined, according to the school board, and again, not all trustees voted to bring back police in schools, but those who had, basically the revised and reimagined was plain clothes, right? And smaller guns and so forth, right? Like these reforms, right? The reformist reforms that actually just expand and entrench policing. And so British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, with multiple concerns, again, came out with a Know Your Rights research. So we saw that the date of the decision for the reversal of this particular police-free schools win was in 2022. We've also seen some attempts, unsuccessful, but there have been some attempts to reverse additional police-free schools wins, right? And a lot of them, this push has been significantly for, this non-evidence-based approach of increasing police in schools under, again, the guise of safety, right? And so we saw for instance, in Winnipeg, in the province of Manitoba, particularly at the Winnipeg School Division, there were committee level talks of reinstating a possible police and school program. We've seen multiple attempts across the province of Ontario. For instance, in Ottawa, there are multiple attempts by an Ottawa Carleton District School Board trustee to increase police presence. The same thing had happened in Toronto, where a numerical minority of trustees attempted to equate school safety with police and policing school programs. Peel Region, again, there was discussions by way of parents and community members asking to bring back police and school program. And in Simcoe Region, elected officials were pressuring actually boards to bring back police and school programs, right? So again, we're seeing a national trend of some attempts to reverse police-free school wins. And again, under this guise of safety, as mentioned previously, again, there are attempts to increase police presence under the guise of safety and tackling gun violence, right? And so the province in Quebec. And so when we're talking about Montreal, what's called currently known today as Montreal, Quebec, $4 million were given, a bit over $4 million were given for police and school programs that target Black racialized immigrant neighborhoods first and foremost. And our partners based out of Montreal, École Sans Police, have been organizing against it. And again, we see this funding for Montreal Police is to establish a specialized division that focuses on schools, right? So this is, again, the expansion, these reforms for expanding to new police and school programs. Equipe École. And so we know that these are manufactured crises. Governments and mainstream media call what they call youth violence, school violence, gun violence, community violence, among many other crises, are manufactured. And this is due to policy choices and failures by elected officials. This is complete negligence, right? Again, we have more than enough data, reports, and research as to what has to be done. And so the reality is this is due to elected officials' negligence. And so we know that as these pushbacks continue, so will the fight for police and policing free schools. And so for us, it's particularly important when looking at the national landscape and terrains of police and policing in school programs. Why is it that principled decisions, values-based decision-making for initial police-free schools is important, right? And so we've seen, so for instance, an example, New Westminster, New Westminster, based out in British Columbia, recognized that there was more than enough information on the harmful impacts of police and school programs. And it actually made them reflect as a board to move forward with a decision and remove a program without actually continuing to re-traumatize young people and students with having to retell their stories to complete a review, right? So that's New Westminster and British Columbia. The Waterloo Region District School Board in Ontario removed their program without needing a review, because again, there's more than enough data, reports, and research, lived experiences telling us what we already know. And they recognize again that there was more than enough information on the harmful impacts. We see also in Hamilton Wentworth District School Board, another example, they canceled also their police and school program without needing a review. As again, there was an acknowledgement that there's more than enough evidence of the harms on students. And again, this is community was also leading the push here. And so we have other multiple examples. For instance, the Winnipeg School Division in Manitoba initially had basically just said that it's due to financial reasons, right? That is not a principled decision. They made it just solely for financial reasons. Likewise, for Charlottetown schools in Prince Edward Island, they had just mentioned that there's not enough staff to have and continue their particular police and school program, namely the school resource officer program, right? And so what's really important, especially when we're seeing a national trend of attempts to reverse these decisions, it's particularly important that they be grounded in principled decisions to ensure that police and school programs are not being brought back until there is a province and territorial systems change. And so when we're talking about rebranding of police and school programs, again, this is very much a national issue. We see that, again, an example at the Vancouver School Board, right? Their original police and school program name was the SLO program, the School Liaison Officer Program. They rebranded it as a quote unquote revised and reimagined School Liaison Officer Program, right? The Edmonton Public School Board, their original police and school program, the SRO program, the School Resource Officer program. And so some context for this one, Edmonton Public Schools had placed a pause their program for a review. They came out with a youth enhanced deployment model, which was, again, perpetuating the status quo, just a rebranding of police and schools. And since then, more so recently, as of this year in April, when there was a vote that actually brought back police in schools, despite our partners, Policing Free Schools Edmonton, that were pushing back, along with multiple other folks in Alberta that were pushing back on this decision. The school board decided to, rebrand it as a reintroduction of police in schools, right? Reintroducing police in schools. They also put it under a formal role in division schools to enhance student and staff safety, right? So we see that there's a rebranding or a renaming. And also most recently, and so that's in Alberta. An example in Ontario is the York Region District School Board. So they had two police and school program names, School Resource Officer, and also the Youth Education Officer program. And so they rebranded it as new school police programs, right? Again, these are reformist reforms that are just there to further entrench police and policing within schooling spaces. Another example for a Catholic board, for instance, the Toronto Catholic District School Board had rebranded previously their School Resource Officer program. It was rebranded as the School Engagement Team Officer Support Program. Other examples of a continuation of police in schools, and not necessarily a rebranding, but in Fredericton in New Brunswick, most recently, there's been a statement of unpausing a police and school program to restart this September of this year. We saw in Calgary, Alberta, even though there hasn't been a statement of how they'll be moving forward, there was a review in Calgary, Alberta. There was a review with an intention, again, to quote unquote reimagine and transform police engagement in schools, for police engaging youth in schools. And was really looking at reimagining the School Resource Officer program at Calgary Police Service. And again, this was where more than half of Calgary students across 4 diverse demographic groups held negative perceptions of police, including fear, mistrust, and injustice. And this was according to the review of the School Resource Officer program. And then we see London, Ontario, the London District, another example of a Catholic board, the London District Catholic School Board decided to continue police and school programs, even with a scathing review and report stating that police presence and police and school programs trigger, activate, and traumatize young people within their schooling and educational spaces. So we see this rebranding, right? And so we see a continuation also when looking at the national landscape and trends. We see this ongoing rebranding and co-optation, right? There's a co-optation of terms, right? There was a co-opting of reimagining. There's a co-opting of transforming. There's a co-op of also, in this example, calling their programs evidence-based, right? They're looking at shifting away from another program, which is a police and school program, is the DARE program, right? And so they're talking now about how the DARE program isn't evidence-based, but this new program is evidence-based, right? And so we're seeing how there's a co-optation and a rebranding of language, right? They're talking about using data-driven practices. They're talking about strengths-based. They're talking about, trauma-informed programming. They're utilizing a lot of the language in attempts to rebrand and revise to, again, continue having access to young people within schooling and educational spaces. And this, again, is very much a national issue. We see also rebranding co-optation. So for instance, an example, in London-based schools, they had the Center for Organizational Effectiveness do a review of police and policing in schools. And the Center for Organizational Effectiveness basically stated that they were going to utilize, right, this co-optation of language of trauma-informed, right? They had mentioned that they were going to utilize the trauma-informed approach to assessing the creation, organization, and utility of school resource liaison officer programs, right? And so the co-optation is really insidious, because when we delve into just like not even a deep research, but when you go into researching who had authored the trauma-informed approach to assessing the creation, organization, utility of school resource liaison officer programs that the Center for Organizational Effectiveness was going to be utilizing for that review, we see that it was the North American Center for Threat Assessment and Trauma Response, right? So when we dive in deeper, they are also known as the Canadian Center for Threat Assessment and Trauma Response. And so both those names are previous names, and they are currently also known as the Center for Trauma-Informed Practices, right? And so this is the piece when we're going to be looking at this. So remember the names, because Public Safety Canada actually recognizes the Canadian Center for Threat Assessment and Trauma Response for SRO, a police and school program implementation, right? And so we have the Government of Canada, Public Safety Canada, that documents and recognizes this particular organization as being utilized for implementing the SRO, police and school programs, right? And we see that Public Safety Canada also actually documents them as part of the critical elements for the implementation of this program. And so it was a co-optation of, language such as trauma-informed that, folks would think, oh, this must be better, right? When in reality, it is just a guise to be able to further expand and implement police and school programs. So it was completely unethical for the Center for Organizational Effectiveness and also the senior staff who kept pushing for London-based schools to bring back, again, this revised police and school program, right? And so we do see a differentiation where the Thames Valley District School Board voted to not bring back police in schools and to focus on the root issues. And distinctly, the Catholic Board in that region decided, regardless, to move forward with bringing back police in schools. And so again, we see that this is very much a national issue when they are attempting to co-opt language and paint it as benevolent. And so there's a particular issue also when we're talking about police and police in school programs. So for instance, even some of the schooling and educational spaces that as a system have removed police in school programs, we have been getting contacted and calls by educators, by families and young people, letting us know that administrators are calling police into their schooling and educational space, even when their schooling and educational space has already committed to the removal of police in school programs, right? So we're seeing administrators calling police in for doing basketball games, giving bike giveaways just to have a presence, right? And so we're also seeing at the same time an increase in police in community youth program, right? We're seeing police being deemed as wraparound service providers, right? As social service providers, right? We continuously see private and corporate funding to police, and police leading charitable foundations. And ultimately, this is police entrenching themselves into all community spaces and everyday practices, right? Whether it be, police hosting youth robotic programs, police giving driving lessons, developing driving courses, hosting golf lessons, organizing ball hockey programs, running boxing programs, whether it's, again, as mentioned before, for instance, here example, where Winnipeg kids go shopping with cops, right? Another point here was in Edmonton, most recently, again, their school resource section, we're taking out students for back to school shopping, right? We're seeing, police being brought into early learning centers, right? Pre-K, right? So it's not just about K to 12 and post-secondary. We're talking about this being pre-K to post-secondary, right? There's a continuum of schooling and educational spaces, right? We're seeing where police are being brought in to do anti-racism within schooling and educational spaces. We're seeing police and the being brought in to do anti-racism is an example from Windsor. In Vancouver, police are doing connecting with young people to do talking about healthy relationships and consent, right? And these are all things that other social service providers are able to do, that folks from community are able to do, that they have been doing from time, right? And so why is it again that we're seeing policing continue beyond police in school programs, right? And so not only are police not necessary for any of this, these are policing in community youth programs, further entrenching children and youth in conditions within a continuum of surveillance, push out, criminalization, and harm. And through Policing Free Schools, I see the multiple ways that police and policing institutions insatiably seek out access and contact with children and youth. This access and contact with children and youth for many young people is adverse police contact, and harm shows up in multiple ways. And what I call pallooming, police and grooming, what I call pallooming is one of those aspects. And rather than safeguarding children and young people, right? Again, nationally, and rather than safeguarding children and youth, many, including elected officials, schooling spaces, educational spaces, administrators, nonprofits, charities, even community-based organizations or collectives, are the ones actually creating and feeding pathways for police access to young people, right? So each and every one of us have a duty and responsibility to ensure that folks understand the harms of police presence, both within police and school programs, but also beyond the schooling and educational space. And so those were just like really a few examples, right? It is quite the industry, right? And so we're seeing a tiered and layered policing, right? And so actually, Spring Magazine talks about, and I'll quote it. So when we're talking about tiered and layered policing, Spring Mag states, it is expanded policing, reaching throughout community spaces and everyday practices, right? And it is a model in which social services are framed as policing functions or policing partnerships, right? Ultimately, tiered and layered policing is expanded policing, right? And so, when we're talking about building liberatory, life-affirming spaces, Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks to us about, you know, it is about present. It's not just about, dismantling, right? It's about building life-affirming institutions, right? Miriam Kaba and Andrea J. Ritchie talked to us about, hey, let's take money from death and put it towards life-giving versus death-making, right? Alex S. Vital talks to us about, as mentioned, that the problem is not over policing, it is policing itself, right? Robin Maynard also speaks to this about stating problem, again, it's not over policing or racially disproportionate policing, but policing itself, right? So again, ultimately, tiered and layered policing is expanded policing, and this is what we are seeing also across so-called Canada. And again, police contact for many young people is adverse contact, right? This is an ACE. This is an adverse childhood experience, right? These are adverse impacts. And so needing to reduce police contact is a harm reduction method. And sadly, this narrative of relationship building to increase police contact continues to be used. This is both historical and present day, right? Again, nationally, right? And an example here is where folks, rather than having harm reduction methods, there are many who have harmful schooling and educational policies and procedures that seek to increase police contact, right? And this is intellectually disingenuous about the narrative of relationship building, right? And we're seeing that this relationship building is where police are being called in for things that they have nothing to do with, where police are not necessary, right? Even from this news clip, right? And I quote, when asked about the trend, Chief Gary Kahn, and this is in the Chatham, Kent, but it's also seen in many other communities, said that there are a multitude of reasons for the increased interactions, with many of the causes societal in nature, such as neglect, poverty, addictions, and social media, right? And also the report had added, and I quote, the calls were of varying complexity and signified a need for more youth-related services within the social services sector, right? But we're seeing schooling and educational spaces enhancing their policies to increase police contact, right? That is gross negligence. This is not just about building relationships, which is, again, intellectually disingenuous, right? And Alexander Da Costa, based out in University of Alberta, most recently spoke to this, right? Again, it's intellectually disingenuous. This narrative of relationship building, it is a historical narrative, and it is still a present day narrative. And Alexander Da Costa has spoke about relationship building and the normalization of police in schools through the case study, primarily based out in Alberta, and Edmonton and Calgary. But again, this is something that we see across nationally. And to the extent that we even in so-called Canada, we have a high school, right? We have a grade 9 to 12 high school program that is led by teachers alongside police officers, right? Police officers are leading this high school alongside educators, right? This is a partnership between Regina Public Schools and Regina Police Service. It is a law enforcement themed curriculum, a law enforcement oriented program, and it is deemed, quote, an alternative style of schooling. We now have police-led schooling and educational spaces in so-called Canada since 2020. The Scott Police Academy program, right? Again, we are seeing this ongoing attempts to increase police presence. And this is also has happened at a time where chronic underfunding, again, chronic underfunding of education, chronic underfunding of healthcare system. This is in Regina, Saskatchewan. Chronic underfunding of social services, and again, plundering funds, plundering and siphoning money out of communities and funneling them into policing, to the point where, again, we have in so-called Canada a high school that is led by police alongside an educator. And that is the Scott Police Academy program. And so definitely one of the concerns nationally is that this automation of police ending up to replace educators, which we had seen in one particular space south of the colonial border in the US. Meanwhile, COVID was happening. Well, we are still in an era of COVID, but when previously they started automatically replacing educators in one of the states with police, right? And so the fact that we in so-called Canada have already a Scott Police Academy program that's being paid for, that's being looked at, one of its kind, there are concerns that this may be replicated across nationally. And so again, this is some information in regards to the High School Police Academy, which is again extremely concerning, where police are leading our schooling and educational spaces. And so ultimately, we need systems change. Going, school board by school board, post-secondary institution by post-secondary institution is not sustainable. The way that the system is set up, they want, community members, community organizers, families, young people to tire out, right? Going one by one, schooling and educational spaces is not sustainable. It is extremely tiring. We need systems change, right? We need to move beyond a singular schooling and educational space, right? And we do actually, if we were to have the political will at provincial and territorial levels, we are able to have governments mandate the immediate removal of police and policing, carceral and punitive infrastructures, practices, and policies from educational spaces. We would be able to have governments who amend already existing legislation and create new legislation that simultaneously works to uproot policing, carceral, and punitive culture and logic, alongside creation of accountability measures, and properly and equitably fund and resource the co-creation of transformative, healthy, equitable, anti-racist, anti-oppressive, life-affirming, liberatory, healing-centered, public educational spaces across the continuum of preschool, right, pre-K, K-12 school boards, and post-secondary institutions. And here is some of the existing legislation by province and territory that would be able to be amended. And so let's have a quick look. And so this is in British Columbia. They would be able to amend the Maintaining School Safety, a guide for school and police personnel in British Columbia. In Alberta, they would be able to amend a guide, partners, a guide to effective collaboration between school administrators and police working in schools, right? So these are just some of the legislation that would be able to be amended that we're showing. In Saskatchewan, they would be able to amend a framework for the development of school division, operational policies and procedures. There may be also additional legislation that may be able to be amended. And again, creation of new legislation. Here is an example in Manitoba. They would have to amend their Safe and Caring Schools Provincial Code of Conduct, right, as it relates to appropriate interventions and disciplinary consequences. Their Safe and Caring Schools, a policy directive and action plan to enhance student presence and engagement, right? And so there are distinctions based on, again, where you are situated across so-called Canada. So for instance, in Manitoba, Police notification is based on discretionary, right? On the folks who are within the schooling educational space, it is discretionary for when they are to be notified, right? And then, for instance, in Ontario, we have a provincial model for a local police and school board protocol, right? And this is within the K to 12. And so again, this would be able to be amended. And in this one, there are already instances of when schooling and educational spaces are mandated to contact police in schools. And so we're able to ensure police as an instrument of last resort. And that is something that other provinces, such as Manitoba, doesn't even necessarily have in the moment, right? So when we're talking about K to 12 schooling and educational space, it would be the Community and Safety Policing Act that would be able to be amended as it relates to special constables within post-secondary institutions, and the provincial model, again, for local police school board protocol as it relates to K to 12 educational spaces, in addition to additional legislation as it relates to pre-K. To Quebec, it would be the frame of reference, police presence in educational institutions. And so again, this would be legislation. They would be able to amend it. Newfoundland and Labrador, the Safe and Caring Schools policy will be able to be amended. And again, creation of new legislation as well. We're seeing in New Brunswick, the Keeping Our Schools Safe, a protocol for violence prevention and crisis response in New Brunswick schools. And also their policing standards, right? They would be able to amend ORG 1.4, where it states police forces shall liaise with school officials in support of promoting community-based policing and ensuring that safe school plans are in place. And so there would be able to be amendments to this legislation to move towards police-free schools, and then along the continuum towards policing-free schools. In Nova Scotia, there is the Nova Scotia Provincial School Police Protocol. Again, that would be able to be amended along additional legislation. Prince Edward Island. Again, this is just some images showing how the province is actually funding police in schools. And they would just be able to, again, be able to amend their particular legislation as it relates to the Police Act, and also within the Education Act as it relates to their school liaison officers. That was Prince Edward Island. And now looking at the Yukon, this is a territorial issue, right? In addition to it being a provincial issue, this is a territorial issue. And Yukon would be able to amend their Safe and Caring Schools policy, right? There's some image in regards to the wages for school liaison officers within Yukon. And again, this is information that some folks, even when I've connected with folks in territories, they state that they don't necessarily have a police in school program, but in many instances, those police in school programs are there. They just may not be as highlighted. And many young people and community members themselves may not necessarily be aware, but this is definitely happening also within territories. In the Northwest Territories, they would be able to, just make amendments to the Education Act, looking at safe and caring schools. None of it in that territory, they would be able to amend their programs in schools, also looking at their Education Act, right? And so we know, again, that this is possible. A systems change beyond a single schooling and educational space is necessary. And this is why we need additional regional campaigns, provincial and territorial campaigns to move beyond a single schooling and educational space, and the importance of that. And so finishing off, our last segment for today is Police-Free Schools Complex and the necessary shift towards policing-free schools. And so we know that police-free schools is necessary, and we're going to dive into why we now talk about policing-free schools. And so over the years, as a police-free schools organizer nationally, being in solidarity, connecting and knowledge exchanging with other organizers and folks from other organizations, I delved into an analysis of what had been happening within and across our terrains and landscape. And I noticed what I call the police-free schools complex, which also led me to create policing-free schools at that time, right? And so we'll go into what police-free schools complex is. But one of the reasons why what had also led to the creation of policing-free schools was because, again, as we were talking about rebranding and co-optation, we also saw co-optation, right? I saw co-optation of the push for police-free schools, right? There was a co-optation of the original call for police-free schools, right? And there was this, equating this call with the act of solely removing their initial police and policing in school programs, right? There was also educational spaces who were not doing the ongoing critical work that communities that we had, many of us had been demanding. Educational spaces, schooling and educational spaces that had never had a policing in school program, and claimed that they are police-free schools. And so the removal of police and policing in school programs across all educational levels, including post-secondary institutions, had always been a first and necessary step on a longer and larger journey towards liberatory education, right? And so this co-optation of that original call and schooling and educational spaces not really, moving towards policing free schools, really is what led to the creation of policing free schools. And so what I call police free schools complex was really based in that analysis, that national landscape analysis, that analysis on the terrains, and it's based on the reality and recurring pattern that many educational spaces attempt to legitimize themselves for enacting the initial, right, their original, the initial removal of their original police in school program or policing in school program. Meanwhile, leaving root issues intact, and as a result, perpetuating harm. And so because of that, it was ultimately necessary to say policing free schools, right? And the reason why we say policing free schools is, again, it's a tactic to combat co-optation. It's a rallying call and affirmation. It makes us directly recognize and orient us towards action around the reality that policing and carcerality operate in a myriad of ways, in a multitude of ways in schooling and educational spaces. It's also recognizing, expansion of police and policing in schools moves beyond solely a police in school program. It extends to anything that would otherwise expand police presence, policing carceral measures in educational spaces. As y'all may recognize what we were talking about, the fundamental pieces in the beginning of this teaching, right? And so that's ultimately why we say policing free schools, right? And it's about changing the social conditions that are at the roots. And so we also find it exponentially important to have folks shift away from the school to prison pipeline metaphor, right? And really take up the school prison nexus metaphor, right? And so one of the earliest scholars on this that had proposed to utilize the nexus metaphor is Erica Miners. And they really described it, and I quote, "Linkages between schools and jails are less a pipeline, more a persistent nexus or a web of intertwined punitive threads," right? And Connor and Rosen state, "A network of institutions, policies, practices, and ideologies." And Nunez, Eddy add, "operate in collusion to exclude, control, disenfranchise, and oppress," right? Miners also talks about this, and I quote, "The tentacles in policies, practices, and informal knowledges that support, naturalize, and extend relationships between incarceration and schools," end quote. And the school prison nexus, Rodriguez and Stovall talk about as a deep relationship between schools and prisons in infrastructure, policies, and practices that is grounded in the entrenchment of white supremacy and carceral cultural control in schooling and educational spaces, right? So again, Erica Miners talks to this about this is historic, systematic, and multifaceted nature, right? So even though, as the pipeline metaphor signifies that there is this kind of like a conveyor belt, we're still moving towards it, right? But school prison nexus actually opens it up to the multiple ways that these practices, policies, and institutions are interconnected, and as theorized within school prison nexus are symbiotically linked, right? Feeding off of each other, seeing many young people as disposable. And so we know that policing free schools is a must. First and foremost, policing happens in educational spaces and schooling spaces, even without police presence, right? When looking at it through school prison nexus framework, right? There's multiple ways also that policing carcerality show up in educational spaces. And it's essential to dismantle the root issues and be able to co-create liberatory learning spaces. And so we know that educational spaces can be sites and are sites of struggle and are sites of policing carcerality and trauma, right? In many instances, especially when chronically underfunded, there's a deprioritization of building connections, right? There's a deprioritization of healing-centered engagement, relationship-centered practices, transformative justice, and so forth, right? And so the belief systems that continuously see police presence as connected to carcerality, as connected to being trauma, needs to be highlighted, right? And that looks in multiple ways, right? And so for folks who read Mariam Kaba and Andrea J. Ritchie's book, No More Police, in chapter 4, I believe, it's a chapter on soft policing, what they call soft policing, which is this, it's not necessarily soft because it's still harmful, but it's more so insidious. And so recognizing that police, again, are not the only ones who do policing. For instance, care work professions, examples, social workers, in many instances can become agents of policing, right? Also looking at the family policing system, right? Extension of agents of policing. And this artwork was by Flynn Nichols for Project Mia. And so I'm going to quote Carla Shalaby when they talk about carceral logics, and really recognizing and grounding us in acknowledging that policing and carcerality are present in educational spaces. And so I quote, "Carceral logics refer to the normalized and seemingly common sense ideas, practices, behaviors, and ways of being and thinking that have been shaped, often unconsciously or invisibly, by a commitment to punishment, imprisonment, exclusion, and disposability," right? And Carla Shalaby further adds, "These logics uphold the carceral state by explicitly and implicitly driving the kinds of actions and beliefs required to justify the existence of police and prisons." So that's carceral logics. And so what now, right? What now, once we recognize that policing and carcerality are within our educational spaces, even beyond police presence and policing in school programs, right? And Mariam Kaba really invites us for, ultimately a paradigm shift, right? And I quote, and they state, "When we set out trying to transform society, we must remember that we ourselves will also need to transform." And the shift really, this is heart-centered work. This is not just about shifting. Yes, 100%. It is about shifting our thoughts and our belief systems, but it's ultimately also about shifting our hearts. And so educational spaces are also, as they are sites of struggle, they are also beautiful sites of communal care and healing, where building connections are present, right? Where transformative justice can be seen, where relationship centered practices can also and very much continue to this day, healing centered engagement and practices, right? And so really thinking about, again, what are those ideologies, values, belief systems, and attitudes? What are the limiting beliefs that continuously want to, state that police and policing equate safe and safety, right? When in reality, what is it about that belief system that's telling us that, right? What are those limiting beliefs? And really recognizing what actually creates schooling and educational spaces as sites of communal care, as sites of being healing. And as mentioned previously, policing free schools is heart-centered work, right? It is grounded in connection making. It is grounded in relationality. It is grounded in communal and collective care. It's grounded in systems of decarceral care and shifting hearts. And so what are we recognizing as policing carcerality in educational spaces? And what are oftentimes things that we're not recognizing as policing carcerality in educational spaces? So tip of the iceberg, of course, police presence in schooling and educational spaces, police and policing in school programs, but what else, right? What are other ways that policing and carcerality show up in our educational spaces, in your schooling and educational spaces? What are ways that we or you may be perpetuating policing and carceral measures, even without intent, right? And so again, policing carcerality, right? Policing carceral culture and logics, infrastructures, practices, and policies, systems, right? They show up within educational and schooling spaces in numerous harmful ways. Again, beyond the presence of police and policing in school programs, right? For instance, corporal punishment, which is actually still legal here in so-called Canada, and actually is a truth and reconciliation call to action number 6. Folks can support Bill C-273 that Peter Julian has put forward for ending corporal punishment. Another way that policing carcerality shows up in schooling and educational spaces is by seclusion and restraint. Seclusion and restraint happens across provinces, territories. This is a national issue. It shows up through punitive and exclusionary disciplinary practices. It shows up through isolation, exclusionary timeouts, right? Instead of timeouts, which are also detrimental to child and youth development, why aren't we having time-ins? Why is it that, again, punitive measures continue to this date? We're talking about technological surveillance, discriminatory dress and hair codes, policing of gender expression and sexual orientation, right? Limitations imposed on and challenges to bodily autonomy. We're talking about academic streaming and standardized testing, which all falls under policing and carceral measures, right? These are all examples of how policing and carcerality show up in our educational spaces, right? And this is grounded in a culture and logics of a carcerality. And ultimately, police and policing free schools is possible. It is essential, it is practical, it is evidence-based, it is fiscally responsible, and it is what will actually support the co-creation of healthy learning conditions. And so that systemic paradigm shift, moving us towards liberatory educational spaces, we're here to continue our individual and collective unlearning, learning, and relearning journey and healing journey, right? It's about ourselves also recognizing and naming within our own schooling and educational spaces how policing and carceral practices policies, logics, infrastructure, and logics shows up. It's about recognizing and naming how we, myself, yourselves, perpetuate policing carceral measures and logics, right? It's about connecting and organizing alongside others where you may have access and positional privilege. It's about getting involved outside of the classroom, but also inside the classroom. Connect with us, plug into the local work, and work to transform ourselves. Please, please, we have an abundance of resources and research at our website. It's www.policingfreeschools.ca. We have more information. We have a compilation of, again, the data, reports, and research under our resources. We have our British Columbia Civil Liberties Association partners, their Know Your Rights booklets, a bunch of excellent resources and information on our website. Please www.policingfreeschools.ca. And for additional information for our next national teach-in, which will be led by Erica Miners, as it relates to the school prison nexus and much more information towards liberatory education. Please, you can register at our national teach-ins link. And yes, feel free to connect with us, connect with me. Our email, connect@policingfreeschools.ca. Website, again, policingfreeschools.ca. And Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. Follow us, share with your contacts, and sign up also on our website. Sign up to our mailing list. And please do connect with us. And again, extending gratitude to all y'all, to young people, students, parents, caregivers, guardians, educators, administrators, elders, community organizers, and community members, wherever you may be from coast to coast to coast and beyond. Thank you for joining us in this critically necessary National Back to School Digital Teach-In, Part 2 of 3, Police and Policing in Schools, National Landscape and Terrains. So much gratitude again.